Good afternoon, and welcome to the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation's webinar, Discovering Resilience on the Pediatric Brain Tumor Journey. My name is Heather Held, and I am the National Family Support Programs Manager for the PBTF. We are honored to have you joining us today for this important webinar. The Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation provides programs and resources to support families facing a pediatric brain tumor diagnosis throughout their journeys. We will provide links to some of those programs and resources at the end of today's webinar. Before we get started, I have a few guidelines to review today. You are muted for this webinar and your video is disabled, but we welcome questions during and after the opening remarks. Please type your questions into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will not get to every question, but we'll try to answer as many as possible. Today, we'll hear from our presenter, and then two parents will join her for a panel discussion. Kathy Riley, our Vice President of Family Support, will host the Q&A portion of our webinar. Dr. Claire Russell received her PhD in Counseling Psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2013. She then completed her clinical training at Nationwide Children's Hospital, where she worked until September of 2021. At Nationwide Children's, Dr. Russell was the primary psychologist for children with brain tumors and their families, working with them through all phases of treatment, from initial diagnosis to survivorship. Dr. Russell recently moved to Richmond, Virginia, where she has opened a private practice to serve children and families in the local community. She enjoys baking, reading, and walks with her dog, Tilly, in her free time. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today, Dr. Claire Russell.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about one of my favorite topics, thinking through resilience and how that applies to the brain tumor journey. So I'm ready to jump in. Heather, you can go to the next slide. So I want to start off by just going over the objectives for the presentation today. I want to talk about what resilience is. Within that topic, resilience is a big concept, so I really want to kind of break it into its parts, but I also want to spend a little time on what resilience isn't, because I think it is something that is often misunderstood. And then I really want, my hope for this is that everyone can leave with some really practical strategies and resources and tools. So that is where we will definitely spend most of our time. And then of course, at the end, we'll have time for questions. You can move forward, Heather. So when we think about what resilience is, we're looking at this process of adapting in the face of adversity. And you can see the American Psychological Association kind of gives some examples of what that looks like, talking about trauma or tragedies, and they specifically, highlight serious health problems. And that is obviously what we are focusing on here today. But I think the words that pop out to me here are the adapting and, in the face of that adverse experience. You can go to the next slide, Heather. So really, we develop resilience in times where we're faced with that hard situation that we can't change. And, that's precisely what we are looking at with a brain tumor diagnosis, no matter where you are, right? If you're at the very beginning of that, if you're now navigating some late effects after treatment, we know we're faced with a lot of situations that we cannot change, that of course, as parents, you would change if there was anything you could do that. So resilience comes during those times of distress, but we know in those challenging situations, there can also be opportunity for growth, right? So we talk about this as post-traumatic growth sometimes, where we have talked to kids who've gone through cancer, and they report that, yes, there's a lot of challenges, and we don't want to diminish that at all, but there can be some positive outcomes, like stronger family relationships, experiencing an increased appreciation of life. Survivors often report growth and maturity that comes from it compared to their peers. So when we think about resilience, we're really trying to ask the question of, like, how can we, increase the likelihood of some of those outcomes while also acknowledging that this is really hard and there's an incredible amount of stress. You can go to the next slide. Which brings me to what resilience isn't. It is not having a positive attitude all the time. I think this is something that is very much confused. You know, we can have hope and we can try to be optimistic at times while also still acknowledging what's hard. And we'll talk later, but open, honest communication is absolutely fundamental in building resilience. So it's not being positive all the time. It's not being strong all the time. We all have bad days. You know, I think in particular in the cancer world, there can be a lot of what we sometimes call that toxic positivity, that idea that if you just think positive, everything will be okay, which is why this cartoon spoke to me with this melting snowman, that, you know, that's just too simplistic to always be true. So while yes, having a positive attitude can be great at times, having gratitude is absolutely helpful. That is not what builds resilience. We need to have a lot of room for the range of experience that comes with a brain tumor diagnosis. Next slide. The good news with resilience is I really like this quote by Sheryl Sandberg, who's she's the head of Instagram or high up in Facebook, but she experienced the loss of her husband and wrote a book about resilience. And she talks about it as not something we're just either born with or born with a set amount of, but it's really something that over time we can build. And that is obviously the focus of today, is saying, okay, how can we build this? How can we look at this in a way as a skill, something we can get better at? And Heather, if you want to go to the next slide, there are, I believe, 8 or so things that we're going to talk about today. So these are a list of things that promote resilience in children from this book right here, which I should have cited, so I forgot about that, but it's called Building Resilience in Children and Teens. And they talk about these core concepts. And so what I want to do is take each one of these core concepts and talk about it a little bit more, again, kind of focus on some practical take homes, but really also apply it to the specific journey of a brain tumor diagnosis. So that is kind of the plan for the remainder of my time talking. So Heather, you can go to the next one, which is building security and showing unconditional love. So I often said when I was talking to parents who reported feeling helpless, right? And that they couldn't fix the current situation, they couldn't take away the brain tumor or the late effects, that one of the best things they can do is what they've already been doing, which is showing that unconditional love. So we know time and time again, research shows that what is most helpful for kids who are experiencing stressors is having an adult that they can rely on and who they know loves them. And so you all are already doing the most important thing for your kids. Obviously, you are caring and loving them. And if nothing else, that does far more than you probably can appreciate. Heather, if you keep going, I think there's a little graph, and that should probably be the end of this slide. Yeah. So when we think about, though, building that security, I really go to the power of communication to do that. I think communication, if there's one thing to take away from this whole thing, is just building communication is such a solid base for building up that resilience. It is not just one conversation. We're really talking about how do we open communication in a consistent and ongoing way, because this little graph I made is something I talk about a lot. It's like there's the difficult situation, and that causes a level of distress that we cannot change, right? That's the whole point of all of this. But if we feel alone and misunderstood on top of that situation, well, then suddenly our distress is much higher. So really the goal of communication is to reduce those feelings of being alone, to reduce those feelings of being misunderstood, to reduce the distress that we can. So having those ongoing conversations, and talk a lot about asking good questions. Sometimes in these difficult situations, we go really vague, and I'm guilty of this even as a psychologist, of just like, well, how are things, or how are you? And those questions can be so hard. I'm sure as parents, you've had that, people coming, how are you? And you're like, I don't know. I'm fine now. I was terrible earlier. I was great in between, right? So getting really specific. And I think like asking the question you actually want to know, right? Do you want to know how their mood is? Great. Talk to them. What's something that's made you feel sad lately? When have you felt confident lately? What's something that's on your mind right now that is causing some worry? Or is it, wanting to know about their day? Can you find a more specific way to get to that? So thinking through the questions you're asking and really asking the question you want to know the answer to and getting as specific as you can. Heather, you can go to the next slide. Listening is also just, again, if we're thinking of two core concepts here, it's going to be communication and listening. I have a little video that I think just does an excellent job of what listening with empathy really means. We'll go ahead and watch that.
This is your living room / yoga shanty / regional office / and this.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right, so I love this video and think it just really highlights what's so important when we are trying to have that communication and understanding with kids who are going through a really hard and difficult time. That we want to try to listen without trying to fix it. And we want to listen without trying to dismiss the hard, right? So I love the parts where they talk about and again, I do it too, but talking about the at least, right? Like, well, at least when we are trying to silver line what someone else is saying, I think as a parent, when your kid is in a hard spot, there's such a pull towards like, well, how can I make it better, right? And that there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, of course that's true, but recognizing that sometimes the best thing we can do is just say, I hear you, and I'm so sorry you're feeling that way, and thank you for sharing that with me. Reflection can be such a great tool if we're not sure what to say, right? Again, thinking of that practical piece of advice is just, if you're not sure what to say, reflect it back. I hear that this has been really hard. I'm understanding that you're really worried about this, right? You're not fixing anything, but you're showing that you're listening. It can feel a little odd to reflect, like you're just repeating back. But again, it's really showing that you're hearing what they're saying, that your focus is on them and not kind of in your head running through what are the ways that I can try to fix this for them. Can go to the next slide. So this book also talks about this idea of getting out of the way, that, part of building resilience means that kids have to navigate some hard things on their own. There's an author, Glennon Doyle, who talks about the memo that different parenting generations have received. It's very funny if you want to look it up, but she talks about that the memo this parenting generation received is just never let anything difficult happen to your child, right? This idea of lawnmower parenting, that you should always be like one step ahead of your child, just clearing a path for them so that they don't have to deal with any sort of hardships, right? And what a terrible memo, both for parents who suddenly feel this insane amount of pressure to essentially, protect their child from everything, and we know doesn't help children build resilience. Now, obviously, then you get handed something like a brain tumor diagnosis, and there is no clearing out that path. There is no way of going around it. But within that, trying to think of, are there times where maybe we do need to step out of the way a little bit? We do need to let our child kind of problem solve and work through something with support. This isn't sort of a dismiss and like, you go over there and figure it out, but without maybe jumping in the way that, again, we really want to, because we have that desire as a parent, and again, the messaging that has been received around that. So looking for those times and really asking yourself that question, like, is this something I need to take a step back from to help them work through? Or is this something where they need me, maybe next to them instead of 2 steps in front of them, and trying to be honest with yourself about what might be most helpful there. Next slide. Control and boundaries are big things, again, that often come up in these situations. I think we can all identify those times where things feel really out of control, and so we do our best to control whatever we can. Looking for those opportunities for our kids to give them choices, to encourage some independence, to help them build that up. And, it might be, what medicine do you want to take first? Or it might be, do you want to do this before or after, your appointment today? There's so much that we do not have control over, but getting creative and trying to find some opportunities for those choices can help build that feeling of confidence and competence. While doing that, also maintaining some expectations, kids, and whether young kids or older kids, or frankly, I think adults were the same way. Like, we like having some rules and some boundaries. So I often talk that when we're in the midst of a really stressful time, if our rules and boundaries are normally here, then let's move them to here, right? It's okay to give a little more room. It's okay to say there's a lot going on. And so our rules and our boundaries and our expectations are not going to be the same right now, but can we make sure they're still there? Do we still have some limits on what we can and can't do, some rules, some normalcy that comes with that, right? I've absolutely seen where there's a total loss of those rules and boundaries, which is extremely understandable, but it can lead, I think, often to a feeling of a little chaos for the kids, where they're just not used to that. And so it feels unsettling. So really thinking through, okay, how can we be maybe a little more flexible? How can we adjust some, but without just making it this sort of free for all that ends up not being good for anybody. All right, next. Coping. So developing coping skills is very important, but I try to get really clear about what my definition of coping is. I think often coping is presented as something you do that fixes how you feel. And I had a patient who was probably 8 or 9 and said, if someone else hands me a coloring book when I'm sad and tells me to color, I'm going to be very upset. And I laughed because I was like, it's a very fair point. Because again, I think I like to think of coping as what is something that helps us through the moment, right? That it doesn't necessarily make our sadness go away. I'm not suggesting that going for a walk is going to make this brain tumor journey any less stressful in the end, right? But gosh, if you're having one of those moments and you just need a second and moving your body and getting some fresh air kind of helps you through it, right? Then I think that is still extremely useful. So being clear that these coping strategies don't necessarily fix things, but they help us through it. With coping, I like to think about 2 things. One, I encourage people to write these down because when we are at our highest moments of stress, it is so easy to forget those things that can be helpful. And then I encourage people to think about a variety of strategies. Often we have 1 or 2 things that we know, as you can imagine. For kids, often what I hear first is playing video games. And so I always say, okay, that's okay. We got to come up with more though, right? Because you're not always going to be able to play video games, but also that's not always going to be helpful. Sometimes you might need to get outside and go for a walk. And at other times you might need to curl up and watch a show, and that's fine. So the categories I think through are physical, creative, social, and then the rest and relaxation. And I encourage people to try to have at least 3 or 4 in each of those categories. And in a few slides, we can talk about sort of a way to do this as a family that I think is really important. But this might be a good framework, hopefully, for you all thinking, how can we focus on these skills and do that in a way that feels genuine and not like we're trying to sort of fix the feeling, but tools to help us through. Next. Accessing support. So this is another big one. We know, again, time and time again, something that is shown to be very helpful for families and patients going through a hard time is, what does that support system look like? And it is different for everyone, right? For some people, it might really just be their immediate family. It might be hard to access any level of support. For some people, they might get more support from their community than from friends. But I think this exercise to the side of going like, who are your supports and what are your levels of supports can be a really great way of looking at that. And going, are there circles or are there areas that we're not accessing support from, that maybe there's more support available? This comes with the need to ask for support, which we know can be really hard. But talking this through with your child, thinking about their support networks and how to maintain connection and how to ask for that help can be really, really great. And same for parents. And thinking through the different types of support. So that practical support that we need sometimes, just help doing things, whether it's we need help with rides or, my kid might need some help with their homework as they're trying to catch up on some work that they missed, or the emotional side, right? Just someone for that listening, for that empathy, for that encouragement. Both types of support are really necessary and good to look at that balance and go, am I getting lots of support in one area and maybe a little less in another, and how can we build that up? Next slide. So modeling. I wanted to end on this one because we know this is a parent panel, and this is just so hugely important. And again, I think in these situations where you feel really helpless as a parent, it's so important to remember that your kids are, and it doesn't matter how old they are, they're always watching you and they are learning from you. And if you can model that communication, if you can model showing your emotions, if you can model your coping skills and how you navigate hard days and the self-care you engage in, that is going to teach them so much. I so often heard from parents when I was at the hospital, this idea of like, well, I never, I don't want to cry in front of them. And I would say, cry in front of them. It's actually, that can be good, because you have a chance then to say, yeah, I feel sad about this too, right? I'm sad that we have to be at the hospital. I'm sad you're not feeling good. And that's okay, and I cry, and that helps me release a little bit, which helps me feel better. Now, there's the full-on cry that you might want to do on your own or with a really trusted loved one. And that's not probably the good kind of cry to always have in front of your child. It's certainly okay if it happens from time to time, but it's not your job to pretend like this isn't hard, because it is hard. And so having that honesty and showing them that shows we can talk about that. We can, I can share a little bit about, hey, that really made me sad earlier, or gosh, today just felt like one of those days where I really didn't want to go to the hospital. Do you ever feel that way? Or, it's so hard that we continue to have to navigate some of these late effects years after our diagnosis. Like, does that ever feel tiring to you? Because I feel tired by it sometimes, right? So that communication of our emotions and of those hard days can be so valuable. Coping skills, again, showing, hey, I'm feeling really stressed, so I'm going to go for a walk for 10 minutes. And that's not always possible, but when you can, just showing like I'm doing something to help myself through that moment. I think the coping skills is a great family activity. Have everyone get out a piece of paper, make 4 circles, label physical, creative, social, rest, and relaxation, and try to come up with 3 or 4 things to put in each of those categories. As a family, you guys can talk through, what are similar in your categories, what might be different. As a parent, you can walk through like what helps me sometimes. So that can be a great way to facilitate some of those conversations. And then the self-care I want to touch on, I almost hate to use that word these days, because I think now it somehow means like, go get a pedicure. and what I mean more is just the basics. Like, are you attending to sort of your most basic needs? Are you getting some sleep? Probably not 8 hours, but some sleep in those stressful days and hard moments. Are you making sure you're eating a couple times a day? Are you making sure you're drinking some water from time to time, right? It doesn't need to be perfect, but again, you're modeling that it is important to take care of your own needs in the midst of these stressful situations as well. So you can go to the next slide, Heather. That is my quick overview, and I hope a good balance of practical with, diving into some of these really big concepts. And I'm very much looking forward to being joined for some questions and answers. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Russell, for your powerful and yet practical presentation. I learned so much. I'm Kathy Riley, Vice President of Family Support for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. We're moving into the panel discussion portion of our webinar. We'll welcome questions from all of you. So while I'm introducing our parent panelists, if you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and type it into the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. So it really gives me great pleasure to welcome 2 parents who will join Dr. Russell to answer those questions from all of you. Parents offer such a valuable perspective on the panel as experts on their own child's journey, knowing firsthand the unique challenges that families face during treatment and all that follows. So Christopher and Kathleen, you can go ahead and show us your lovely faces and unmute while I introduce you. Kathleen is the mother to 2 children, Noelle, age 20, and brain tumor survivor Nicholas, age 22. She's been married for 24 years to Andy and has a bachelor's degree in child and family studies. Nicholas was 6 when he started his brain tumor journey, and it took 2 long years for the family. He's faced multiple medical challenges over the years and continues today to do physical and speech therapy. And Kathleen has shared openly that Nicholas will forever be in the care of her and Andy. Chris Wex is the father of 3 terrific kids. His eldest 11-year-old Scarlett was born with a brain tumor that he and his wife, Brandy's and Scarlett's medical team spent the first 3 years of her life fighting. She's now 7 years past treatment, and Chris and his family are navigating those all too common web of challenges, special education, long-term medical questions, those social service bureaucracies, and really working to provide Scarlett the best possible life that she can have. They live in the San Francisco area. Chris is also an independent facilitator for California's self-determination program. And welcome, Chris and Kathleen. So we'll start with some questions. We received one at registration that Claire, you spoke of during the presentation. And I'd like to ask, Chris, we'll start with you, and then Kathleen to answer as well. And then Claire, if you have anything to add. But it's this question of coping skills. So the question is, living with the unknown for so long is difficult. You know, from your family perspective, what coping skills or strategies would you suggest? And Chris, if you would talk from your family perspective, and then Kathleen.
Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, the unknown. There's so many different kinds of unknowns, and some of them are so urgent, and some of them are so long term, and seemingly immovable. And I'll say first of all that just doesn't go away. I don't know who asked the question and where you are in the treatment process, but I mean, you're going to probably always deal with those kinds of uncertainties. And I think that the question to ask is, how do you deal with uncertainty itself, more than how can you get rid of the uncertainties that are in front of you? And I can say what I've done and what we've done. I'm a big practitioner of meditation. I use mindfulness meditation to learn how to sit with discomfort. That's just something that I do, and that I'm able to sort of help impart with all 3 of my kids, which is just to learn to not be so reactive to your own instinct, your feelings of wanting to get away from this painful, uncertain thing, but learning how to sit with that discomfort and identify it, and be able to kind of calm down and sit with whatever it is you're sitting in, and learn to think about what it is those emotions are. And in doing so, I don't feel as though it's a passive activity in terms of actually dealing with the things I can deal with. I think when I am my most centered, I am able to then think about those problems objectively and deal with them in productive ways as well. So I that's one thing I can recommend. I mean, therapy and I mean, it depends on where you and your children are at, but like there are various types of services that can help address where you're at. And I came to this webinar suggesting therapy if you don't already do that, or for some people it's life coaching, or for some people, like I said, it's maybe some guided meditation or something like that. So there's something, but that's a hard problem, and I'm not going to be able to fix it, and I don't think anybody else will either. But I think you can learn to live with it in a way that's more healthy for yourself.
Kathleen, from your family perspective, living with the unknown, could you talk a little bit about some of those coping strategies that your family has enlisted?
My family, it's a lot of it's communication, making sure that we talk to each other. I facilitate that. I will say that I am the one that makes sure to facilitate with my husband and with my cancer kid. My daughter is a good talker, and she'll ask questions out of the blue. She has always done that. And to watch the journey through her eyes has really been helpful, because my son does not talk a lot. He will answer questions. Basically, he understands everything, but he cannot communicate very effectively. So my daughter does a lot of the talking for him. And through her questions, she has forced my husband to face a lot of things that he would not normally talk about, that he would keep everything to himself. But one of the things that I had to do early on was I am the primary decision maker, because I'm the face that's out there with Nicholas all the time, still to this day. But I would always have to say, okay, so here's what I'm thinking. Please add to that. If you can't add anything or don't have anything to add to it, then I need you to be comfortable going forward with what I decide. And that has been my go-to. And sometimes he'll come back with stuff, but other times, he lives with the decisions that I make because it's uncomfortable and hard. It's just hard for him to do this. So our coping strategy, we divide and conquer. He goes out of the house, he goes to work, he provides, he allows me to be home with my kids. And even though we've done with less over the years, at times than others, it's okay, because we've been able to maintain that family unit, which not all families can. And but communication is super important, no matter how it happens. It doesn't always happen, how you feeling. It's sometimes there's a little argument or a little intonations in your voice that you really don't want to have happen. But making sure that you're always there, doing that reflective listening, it does feel very weird if you haven't done it, and especially if you've forgotten to do it for a long time. But it's very important to keep that up. And even with my daughter away at school, she comes home fairly often. And it's important for Nicholas to have that. So we FaceTime. He gets my phone, he sends her selfies. He can get in pretty much any technology. So he facilitates some of that communication on his level. So that's the basics of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will just add a little. I love what both of you said. Kathleen, the part of communication's not always going to go well. Absolutely. And again, that might be like, you're all prepped and ready and you're like, I got my good questions, I'm ready to listen. And you ask something and they're like, eh. You're like, oh, okay. So they might not be there, but then 2 weeks later, right, you're driving in the car and suddenly that little seed pops up with another question, or they have been thinking about it. Or you aren't prepared, or you don't communicate in the way that you wish you had. And that's, of course, that happens daily. But I think that's also where that ability to go back and kind of talk about it, right? And go, okay, that didn't go well, or I've been thinking about that, can be good. And Chris, I really like that suggestion of those meditation, relaxation practices. Obviously, I love the suggestion of therapy because I think it's very helpful. So yeah, both excellent points.
We've had a question that came in on the Q&A, and I think I'll ask this. I'll throw this question out to the group, and then if neither parents have had this experience, then Claire, perhaps you can address it from your practice. But the question is, has anyone had the challenge of tumors coming back, you know, after a promising diagnosis?
We have not had that, but we've had multiple other medical issues afterwards, and each one feels like your world, the bottom has dropped out again, and you are scrambling to find the answers. And I don't know if Chris feels like this or if other parents feel like this, but I feel like I needed to have all of the information that every doctor, every medical personnel has ever had in my armamentarium to figure it out. That just happened to coincide with how my son's diagnosis went. You know, if I didn't ask the right questions, then I didn't elicit the information that the medical professional that I was talking to had. They clearly had answers. They didn't have the right questions from me to elicit those answers. So it's a tough situation. And so, no, we haven't had recurring tumors. It scares me every time we go to the doctor for that, for MRIs. But no, we've not had that. We've had heart attack and pertussis and many other things. So.
Yeah, we thought we'd beat it through our first round. We had a gross total resection of Scarlett's brain tumor. Went through 18 months of pretty heavy hitting chemo, and then had many months of clear scans. And then, yeah, we had a small recurrence, which was very, you know, it is, the floor dropout phrase is like just about right. Like it just almost catches your breath. Not sure the question is, what was the question particularly? It was how we deal with that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It was addressing it. It was addressing, we just went into what do we need to do mode. Like what, like one of us is taking notes, we're listening carefully, we're addressing what's next, what's the next step, what's the next best thing we can do. It's not really the moment when I can address the sort of long, pondersome, meandering, you know, feelings and reactions to things that have happened in the past. It's actually a time of action is the way that we dealt with that. But, you know, we worry about that in the future too, as Scarlett kind of approaches puberty, in the tendency for individuals who've had chemotherapy and brain tumors to have recurrences at puberty is always a possibility in the future to have some kind of secondary tumor or something of that nature. So you know, we just we just try and address it as it arises and then move on, sort of. But yeah, that was stressful, and I can't imagine if that's what you're dealing with. That's a really terrible thing to have to deal with, honestly. So just my heart goes out to you.
Can I just say that, you know, Chris and I seem to each have a significant other to walk this journey with. For those of you that are doing this singly, try to find a person, hopefully that you have a person that you can rely on to walk with you on this horrific journey, because having that extra person, that extra set of ears and eyes to listen to things is extremely helpful. because how we hear things is not always how it's actually been said to us, and having that second person around to just even bounce ideas off of and questions, and to process the information, and be able to explain that to your child in a way that they can understand is extremely helpful.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing from your own journeys, and for that wisdom. We have a question from an oncology social worker that Dr. Russell, I think I'll ask you. As an oncology social worker, how can I best support patients and their caregivers during an initial diagnosis or relapse discussion?
Yeah. Something that was always helpful for me, and I think this applies in this situation, and I hope can apply for parents listening too, is to always pause before kind of going into those discussions and asking myself, what's my goal? Because I think as a healthcare professional, as a helping profession, again, I have to imagine as parents, right? It's like, really what I'd be like, well, is to make this better, right? Like to help. And I always had to stop and pause and remind myself, like, nothing's going to make this better, right? So really, I needed to shift my goals towards, I want these families to know they've got a support person. I want these families to know I can be that second set of ears. Do you want me to take notes? Do you want me, like, how can I be helpful? Or is it just, I'm not going to be too scared to talk about these things. Like I'm here. I'm here to ask questions sometimes if it's, doctors start going and everyone's like, we don't know what they're saying. Like I feel more comfortable with those providers as people I work with to say, hey, can we back up on this, right? Or gosh, other parents have had these types of questions. Are those questions you guys are having right now? But really to kind of make sure I'm clear with myself that like, my goal is not to make this better because I cannot make it better. My goal is to provide support, to show them I will be here. And I think there's a lot of value in that, while not, you're setting yourself up for failure if you're going to try to make it better.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. We have a question, and I'd like to, and really any one of you could answer this question, but someone is asking, how can I explain to my daughter's teachers at school the importance of these kinds of conversations and, giving them the information needed to have a relationship with me as a caregiver and to discuss my daughter's needs. So it's really one of those areas that parents have to deal with. And there's and I see, Chris, you smiling and nodding, a lot of resilience that is needed in this arena as well. But any advice for those school relationships and the importance of those?
Yeah, I'm sure Kathleen, you have some tidbits too. Actually, I work as a special education advocate as part of my work. So I see the question here. Just one of the first things you should keep in mind is if this is a school that receives public funds, if it's a public school, I would add to your daughter's teacher that you should also form a relationship with your school's administrator, principal, or whoever else. My daughter here, my youngest, because your daughter has quite a few rights under federal law that entitle her to special education supports and services and just a whole process that are designed to give your daughter everything she needs to have an educational experience that's equitable to her peers who maybe don't have any challenges related to brain tumors and so forth. So just whoever the principal is or anybody at the school, I would also just add that person. And then to to the relationship piece that I think you're asking about here, which is it's really, teachers are stressed. My wife's a first grade teacher, and you're probably not going to catch him or her on the fly, but do insist and schedule some time to have just a conversation, a conference, or a meeting about your daughter's needs as soon as possible, and try and place this in the perspective. Hopefully this teacher is familiar with some students who've had special education needs, and just say that, my daughter's going to have a lot of additional challenges and needs, and I need to start a process where we can communicate, medical information and my own knowledge about how to meet her needs, because this isn't going to work for her at all unless, we can work together to support her with some additional tools. So, just kind of try and start that like human conversation in a calm setting, when not at dismissal, like just forget about it, but like at a time when the two of you can have your heads on about you and kind of think it through. So that, I think that's a really important piece, whether or not your daughter's in a public or a private school, to just make time for that conversation. And teachers are generally, there because they want to help the kids. And so, as long as you make the space for it, I believe that it's a pretty good bet that if you set that meeting up, having that start a conversation where you can kind of outline some of the challenges you've noticed, and maybe her teacher will give some of that back to, in terms of what they've noticed, you can begin to formulate a plan of some sort together about how to address that. Again, not forgetting the school's obligation to marshal resources in her aid as well.
We had a question come in at registration that, Claire, I would love to hear from you. And it has to do with the idea of the sort of the intertwining of resilience and endurance. And this, the question is, how do families maintain a consistent level of resilience through each year to help our survivor stay optimistic? So Claire, if you could address that, and then maybe Kathleen, if you could make a comment as well.
Yeah. Gosh, my first thought is like, I don't know that that's a realistic goal, to maintain this like certain level of resilience at all times, right? Like that, I just think taking some pressure off, like as a parent, that it's okay to not maintain consistent levels of resilience. And again, I think to just go back to those basics, right? That resilience does not mean we're not having a hard time. Resilience doesn't mean that there's no ups and downs. And some of those key things of just like, you know what, right now, like if one more person tells me to, take time for myself, I'm going to explode. Okay, well then like, maybe that's not the thing right now, right? Maybe you're just going back to like, did I like tell my kid I love them today? Am I every once in a while, at least opening those doors of communication? Am I listening? Great, that's enough, right? And that might be all you can do, like hello during a pandemic and on top of everything else, right? My gut response to that reaction is to take some of that pressure off. But at the same time, also knowing like, building resilience for your family and yourself and your child does not mean we're ticking off all 8 of those categories every single day, but can you look back over the course of months and go, okay, we have done some of this and we have done some of that, and it's okay that there were times where it was a little less, and it's great that there were maybe some times where we felt like that was happening more. It's not a daily checklist. It's really sort of an approach to life and parenting that can certainly sustain the very natural ebbs and flows.
I agree with that. We, as a family, when the pandemic hit, I secretly liked having to stay home because it took away every pressure to get my kid up on time, get him out the door, make sure he was fed, get him ready for therapy, make sure that he had everything he needed for, 2 or 3 hours of therapy that day and multiple times a week. And so it brought us back to that time when we had to pull in our entire family and we weren't allowed to have people over, and it made us focus on each other. My daughter came home from college. My husband was working from home for the first time ever. And it made us look at each other differently and refocus. And so that was just one of the things over the years that has honestly helped us. We're all ready to not be locked up anymore. But allowing ourselves the opportunity to basically have a 2-year-old tantrum every once in a while. And that's okay. It doesn't happen every day. It doesn't happen every week or every month, but it does happen. And that's okay. And for all the rest of us to stand back and say, you know what, that person really needs that time, and to not find faults with that. To basically not criticize as much as possible, even though sometimes in your head, you're feeling it. Those are the things that we kind of all have looked at each other. But again, I help facilitate that. Some of that just might be my background, but also sometimes I think that we need somebody. And again, like I said, my husband, his weight is pulled in a different way than mine, but I'm the one that does the more touchy-feely kind of stuff and kind of helps us to organize that. And now my daughter, like I said, she does that a little bit now too. So it's okay not to feel that resilience all the time or to feel like you are resilient. Just know that you are probably modeling it to people who really need it, even if you don't realize you're doing it. So.
Thank you. Thank you both. We are, unfortunately, in the last couple of minutes of this webinar. It would be great to continue talking for another half hour with all of you. You've been so valuable to this discussion. There is a comment in the Q&A that I think is words from a parent that I think are encouraging, and I'll read those, and then we'll go into a couple of resources for the PBTF. But someone in the Q&A said, my son has had 5+ recurrences of his tumor for over 14 years. We're constantly advocating for him and making sure he has a voice too. We practice our faith and make sure we live life to the fullest as a family every day. Communication is key, and sometimes just showing love is enough to get you to the next day. And Claire, that was something that you said to all of us in the beginning. So thank you all. I'd like to thank Dr. Claire Russell for her time today and for sharing her expertise and experience with us. Thank you, Kathleen and Chris, for providing such meaningful and personal insights from your journeys. The PBTF is here to support all of you, no matter where you are in your journey. Please reach out to us for support. There are a couple of resources here that we've listed. Our survivorship resource guidebook is a comprehensive resource with information and practical resources for the journey ahead. It can be requested in hard copy or downloaded online. Our peer-to-peer mentoring program matches family members with trained mentors who have experience with the challenges of a pediatric brain tumor diagnosis. You can find those resources on our website. And then, Heather, if you'll go to the final slide, reach out to anyone on our family support team. Our contact information is here. Thank you for attending our webinar today, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next one. Thank you.